The tension between India and Pakistan is one of the most well-known political standoffs in the modern world, and for good reason. Since the middle of the 20th century, the countries have been at war with each other on multiple occasions and have had no shortage of border disputes and skirmishes year after year. It's one of those places on the globe that seems like it's always just on the verge of all-out war, so much so that it's often referred to as a ticking time bomb. Even if we turn the clock back more than 70 years, the picture is eerily similar. Accusations, suspicion, and violence dominating the headlines, all centered around the front line in a disputed piece of territory, Kashmir. Today we're going to explore why Kashmir is the epicenter of these tensions and who, if anybody, emerged victorious in the first armed conflict fought over this crucial slice of Asia. To understand why both Pakistan and India claim Kashmir, we need to take a look at where the two nations came from in the first place. Obviously, the rich history of South Asia goes back thousands of years, but we're gonna try to cut to the chase here and start the story in the aftermath of World War II, back when India was still a British colony. At this point, British India had been under the direct rule of the British Crown for nearly 100 years, through an administration known as the British Raj. Throughout the years, there have been a number of independence movements for various ethnicities and religions within the colony, all of which had been successfully subdued. But by the 1940s, the British sentiment surrounding India was changing, and the writing was on the wall for its inevitable independence. The vast majority of the people living in British India wanted independence from Britain, but there was a massive debate about how this would actually be implemented. British India was home to dozens of languages, ethnicities, and cultures, something that could quickly lead to a lot of internal chaos if this incredibly diverse region suddenly became independent and united overnight. But of all the issues that would accompany independence, the most glaring was religion, specifically the tension between Hindus and Muslims. To put it simply, many Hindus felt that if India became independent, the rather large minority of Muslims would violently revolt for control over their own affairs, and the general consensus among Muslims was that Hindus would vastly outnumber them in politics and oppress them as a religious minority. This had long been an issue, and extremist groups on both sides had only fanned the flames over the years, such as with Hindu nationalist groups who went as far as to label Muslims as second-class citizens and tried to promote the outright banning of Islam in the country. On the other side, Muslim separatist groups were growing in both size and level of violence, demanding their own separate government. Essentially, if British India was given its independence overnight without any changes, everyone figured that a civil war of some sort would have begun shortly after. But Britain was pretty intent on avoiding any violence, not just because of the humanitarian disaster that it would create in one of the most populated places on Earth, but also because there were high hopes that India would become a powerful ally in the years to come, something that the West was in high demand for at the dawn of the Cold War. So, they started looking into possible solutions, and one option looked as attractive as ever: partition. At its core, the basic idea of partition was to split up British India into two separate countries, one for Muslims and one for Hindus. This idea had been floating around for a while and was originally known as the two-nation theory, in which each country would officially be a religious state, but this had seen a lot of backlash. Now, however, partition seemed like the perfect way to make sure that everybody got what they wanted. Well, except those who wanted a unified India, but that was pretty much out of the question at this point. The official plans went back and forth through an agonizing number of diplomatic meetings, government officials, and general bureaucratic bullshit, until eventually it was decided that the partition would take place sometime in June 1948. However, the violence between the Muslims and the Hindus was already starting to escalate, so fearing a crisis would erupt before the solution could actually take place, the date was launched forward an entire year. And so, in the summer of 1947, the partition was officially announced. Within its territory, the borders of two new nations were carved out: the Dominion of India and the Dominion of Pakistan, separated along roughly religious fronts by what was called the Radcliffe Line. Interestingly, the Dominion of Pakistan was comprised of two separate geographic regions, one to the northwest of India called West Pakistan, and one to the northeast called East Pakistan. Now, you won't find East Pakistan on a map today, as it has since gained its independence and is now the country of Bangladesh. But at the time of partition, Pakistan was in two pieces, separated by about 1,000 miles of northern India, and the diverse border provinces of Punjab and Bengal met, and they voted to partition their provinces roughly in half between the new countries. Also a critical part of today's story, the rulers of the many smaller princely states which weren't officially governed by either nation were given the framework and path to join either dominion as they saw fit, or if they wanted to, they could remain independent. When the news of the partition was announced, everyone was told that they could now migrate into their respective region, meaning Muslims would now head into either East or West Pakistan, and Hindus, Sikhs, and Buddhists would make their way into Indian territory. All of this, the partition and the migration, was known as the Mountbatten Plan, named after the final Viceroy of India. And when asked if the partition would lead to any violence, Mountbatten replied, "At least on this question, I shall give you complete assurance. I shall see to it that there is no bloodshed and riot. If there should be the slightest agitation, I shall adopt the sternest measures to nip the trouble in the bud." So, did it work? Did he nip the trouble in the bud? Did everybody calmly move into their respective regions and live happily ever after? Well, almost immediately, absolute pandemonium broke out. As hundreds of thousands of people moved across borders, savagery erupted as both sides beat, robbed, and murdered anyone with a different view. All along the new borders, the most brutal of violence filled the streets as gunfire, blades, and flames wreaked havoc in every direction. There really aren't words to describe how extreme the violence was, with pregnant women being documented as victims of horrific violence, and even reports of infants being killed in cold blood. Many historians classify this as a form of ethnic genocide, as each side committed atrocities with the intent of harming their enemies physically and psychologically, and by doing whatever they could to limit the other side's future reproduction. In total, an estimated 1 million people lost their lives during the partition, a number so huge it's almost difficult to wrap your brain around it. And this is only those who died. Hundreds of thousands were assaulted or injured, and nearly 100,000 women were kidnapped during the chaos, never to be seen again. On top of this, at least 10 million people were displaced, making it possibly the worst refugee crisis in all of history. To many, the partition of India may have been a gargantuan failure, and it's hard to argue with that in the face of just so much violence and destruction. But even when the violence had simmered down from the chaotic migration, it was far from the end of the problems between the two new dominions. In fact, this was really just the beginning. As mentioned earlier, the many princely states throughout the region were given the option of joining either India or Pakistan as they saw fit, and were even allowed to remain independent if they so wished. There were hundreds of these states ruled by a local leader, and for many of them, the choice was obvious. The religious majority dictated a clear choice of which country to join. However, there were a few places where the choice between India and Pakistan wouldn't be so easy. Enter the star of today's show, the princely state of Kashmir and Jammu, or just Kashmir for short. Situated right at the top of India and just to the west of Pakistan, this rather large territory was in quite a pickle. The Jammu province was majority Hindu, so they would certainly object to joining Pakistan, but the Kashmir province was majority Muslim, so they would certainly object to joining India. Then factor in the large Buddhist and Sikh populations and the diverse districts in the north and west with roughly equal numbers of each religion, and you get a very complicated political picture where nobody can really agree on anything. The ruler of Kashmir, Maharaja Hari Singh, decided that no course of action would be better than a wrong one in such tumultuous time. So he announced that, at least for now, the princely state would avoid joining either dominion. However, as time went on, rumour has it that the Maharaja and many of his fellow political leaders, such as the Prime Minister, began to favour merging with India, especially after a meeting with Gandhi. Eventually, Singh decided that a referendum could be held to decide which dominion to join, but when exactly this was going to take place was anybody's guess, and well, it never actually happened. Unfortunately for Singh, his hesitant neutrality wasn't going to be enough to prevent the inevitable. The first hints of trouble started popping up in Poonch, an autonomous Gir or small principality. Despite being a rather small place, Poonch was actually rather significant, as it had sent more than 60,000 men to fight in World War II, and when the men had returned home from the war, they were allowed to keep their guns. And while Poonch was autonomous, it still fell under the rule of Maharaja Singh's Kashmir, and therefore was eligible to be taxed. And boy, were they taxed. Heavily. Not only were they overly taxed, but they were also banned from joining the army as the Maharaja didn't trust them. No tax campaign had been gaining traction in Poonch for a while now, but it really picked up steam in August 1947 when the Maharaja ordered all men in the area to be disarmed as he feared a rebellion. Well, ordering them to turn in their guns turned out to be the straw that broke the camel's back, and after refusing to give up their arms, Poonch began preparing for an open rebellion. They purchased even more weapons smuggled in through Pakistan and easily overtook several villages and towns in the area. In response, the Maharaja sent his armies to quell the uprising, and it's about this point where the narrative gets a little bit tangled up, because both parties have their own sides of the story. And indeed, these sides at times are just wildly different. So, according to the Pakistani news sources at the time, the Maharaja's army moved into Poonch and began massacring whole villages, mostly full of Muslims, in an attempt to squash the rebellion. They even called it a reign of terror, and according to a British social worker in the area, the army is fired on unarmed crowds of protesters. India denies this, though, and claimed that they only opened fire on armed rebels in a few locations, and they had their own accusations to throw back at Pakistan in return. Pakistan had already cut off all trade routes into the region, depriving many villages of sugar and salt, but they were supposedly planning much more than a simple trade roadblock. According to documents accidentally leaked to an Indian officer, Pakistan was planning an invasion of Kashmir under the nickname Operation Gulmarg. These plans had been in the making as early as August, just a few weeks after partition. The goal was to send in about 20,000 Pashtun tribesmen in 20 militias, known as Lashkars. Half of these would attack the Kashmir Valley, and the other would join up with the rebels in Poonch and a couple of other spots, after which they would all advance to Jammu. Pakistan denies to this day that Operation Gulmarg was ever drawn up, but there is documentation that huge numbers of Pashtun warriors flowed east towards Kashmir's borders in the late summer of that year. And another incriminating tidbit, Pakistan's Prime Minister, Liaquat Ali Khan, had already sent men to investigate the possibility of starting a revolt within Kashmir, but it was determined that an outside attack would be the only way to overturn the Maharaja. Regardless of Pakistan denying these plans, the Pashtun tribesmen did eventually launch said attack. On the 22nd of October 1947, tribal forces moved across the border into the northern Muzaffarabad region and quickly destroyed the Kashmir state defenses there. This wasn't an official invasion by the Pakistani army, but to be honest, it might as well have been, because among the ranks were Pakistani infantry supposedly disguising themselves as tribesmen, and the logistic of the whole operation were handled by Pakistan. But to save face, these attacks were technically raiding parties that had no connection to the Pakistani government. As the Pashtun forces captured villages, they looted and raided everything in their path. And some sources even say they beheaded Sikhs and Hindus that they captured. To the Pashtun tribesmen, these crimes were an act of retribution, as many of them had been told that similar atrocities were being committed against Muslims in Kashmir. And that's at this point that the Maharaja knew that he needed help. Faced with the uprisings in Poonch, growing movements in other cities, and the Pashtun invasion in the north, he reached out to India for military assistance. In a nutshell, India said, yeah, we're happy to help, but it's going to be a cost, guys. Look, for the Indian army to intervene, Kashmir needed to officially accede to India, as they didn't fancy sending their army into a neutral state. The Maharaja voiced his acceptance, and just like that, Kashmir was on its way to being a part of India. It wasn't a done deal yet, though, and Kashmir's Prime Minister made sure to get the point across that nothing official would be signed without a people's vote, something that would have to take place once the armed conflict was over. Pakistan refused to recognize the legality of this deal and claimed that it had only taken place because, from their perspective, India had essentially blackmailed Kashmir into joining. But their complaints fell on deaf ears, and the Indian army began gearing up to kick the tribal invaders out of the province once and for all. Everything was escalating, and there was no going back now. Indian troops were airlifted into the conflict region on the 27th of October 1947 and first touched down in the city of Srinagar, the province's summer capital. There they joined up with local state police forces and began a counter-offensive against the invaders. This was super successful. The Indian troops outmaneuvered and outgunned their opponents, pushing them away from the city after a decisive victory, despite the odds being against them in many firefights. After pushing the invaders even further back, the towns of Uri and Baramulla were recaptured, and a defensive perimeter was set up to hold the ground that they had gained. But while this initial operation had been a major success, things weren't going so well across the rest of Kashmir. In the north, in Gilgit, the paramilitary group known as the Gilgit Scouts had already changed their allegiance and joined forces with Pashtun tribesmen, so much of the northern sector was quickly taken over. And the state forces that had been deployed to the Punch uprising were being surrounded by both rebels and the tribal invaders, and were now taking heavy casualties, lacking the firepower to successfully counterattack. After Indian forces set up a defensive perimeter around the capital, they made the bold decision to head to Punch and rescue the besieged state forces there. However, after joining the battle there, they were unable to lift the siege. The second relief column made its way there, but ended with a similar result, and Punch was beginning to fall under tribal control. And keep in mind, at this point, Pakistan still officially hadn't entered the war. The whole tribesman thing was a way to sort of avoid direct confrontation, even though they had been directly recruited and paid by the Pakistani government and were continually resupplied by the Pakistani Air Force. And regardless of this whole charade, there was a growing number of stranded Pakistani forces entering the arena, but, well, it was still all somehow unofficial. For instance, as tribal forces upped the pressure around the city of Mirpur, they were joined by Pakistan's 11th Cavalry Division, who helped them to eventually capture the city in November. When Mirpur fell, the brutality and cruelty of the conflict was really brought into the light, as thousands of Sikhs and Hindus were massacred in the streets by the invaders, many of them beheaded or even burned alive. Along with an estimated 20,000 civilians killed, as many as 5,000 women were abducted and shipped back to Pakistan to be sold in brothels. Throughout the early days of tribal occupation, an estimated 400 women actually ended their own lives in Mirpur to avoid such a fate. After the fall of Mirpur, quite a lot went down on the front lines. First, the city Janga was captured by the tribal forces, only to be recaptured by Indian troops. Then the town Uri, that had been liberated earlier, became the center of repeated Pashtun attacks, each of which were repelled. By February 1948, much of the front line was beginning to take a steady shape as more and more Indian forces arrived and were able to hold a solid defensive line. It had been several months now since the conflict broke out, and again, Pakistan still hadn't entered the war. But make no mistake, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the Governor-General of Pakistan, was all for it. His requests just kept getting blocked. You see, after British India had been partitioned, both dominions had retained several British officers among their ranks, and it was these British officers, specifically General Douglas Gracey, who denied Jinnah's orders to mobilize the Pakistani army and attack Kashmir. After all, there were British fighting on the Indian side as well, such as Sir Rob Lockhart, a Scotsman who was the commander-in-chief of the Indian army. Both sides had been ordered to stand down in the event their dominions went to war with each other, and they were doing their best to try to keep that from happening. But while the war was slowing down a bit as the front line stabilized, becoming known as the Line of Control, things really weren't heading in a great direction overall. Violence against Muslims reached shocking levels across Kashmir, as many were accused of being loyal to the invaders, and horrific acts of revenge were carried out against them and their families. Meanwhile, on the negotiating side of things, not much was getting done at all. Pakistan had tentatively agreed to withdraw their troops in return for India doing the same, and a new referendum in the various provinces of Kashmir, but this whole plan was vetoed by Jinnah, who refused to scale back his support for the attackers. The UN was going back and forth on the matter for months, failing to come to any conclusions about intervening. Despite this, individual nations such as China were loudly voicing their opinion and were usually in favor of Pakistan withdrawing troops and holding a new UN-monitored partition of Kashmir. But until everybody could come to an agreement and until the UN could actually do something, the fighting raged on, and Pakistan grew closer and closer every day to officially joining the war. In February 1948, the Gilgit Scouts, who had switched allegiances and joined the invaders earlier, launched an attack and besieged Skardu, one of the largest and most important cities in northern Kashmir. Repeated attempts to lift the siege were unsuccessful, and as the men in Skardu slowly ran out of ammunition and food, their situation was becoming increasingly desperate. Completely outnumbered, after a few weeks, they requested permission to simply evacuate and retreat from the city, but this was denied, and they were told to hold out until the last round. The forces at Skardu would ultimately hold their ground for a grueling 6 months of siege until all but 2 of them were killed and the city was captured. In March, the UN passed Resolution 47, a multi-step plan to cool off the conflict by first having each country withdraw their armies. But both India and Pakistan rejected this. By summer 1948, fierce fighting continued for Poonch as the Indian forces attempted to lift the siege on the city, and it was here that news broke out about 3 regular Pakistani army brigades that were fighting alongside the tribesmen. The jig was up, and Pakistan, no longer feeling the need to hide their involvement, now had no qualms about sending a lot more of their regular units into the battle. They were now all in. The terrain around Poonch and more or less all around Kashmir is extremely mountainous, and so Indian forces often had a hard time figuring out how to move their armored vehicles into a lot of the battlefields. Mule tracks across mountains were widened in an attempt to make them jeep accessible, which sometimes worked, but almost none of these could accommodate the much heavier tanks, making it difficult to bring armor to fights that were far from a city or main road. Regardless, the Indian forces besieged at Poonch were able to break a line open to the rest of the forces outside, opening up supply and communication lines. And this little terrain issue didn't stop India from successfully using tanks in the Zojila Pass, an area of the Himalayas, bringing armored warfare to new heights. By late 1948, India was gaining the upper hand in most of the firefights, and Pakistan started sending more and more of their regular units in to keep the lands that they had already captured, making it difficult for India to move forwards, and one huge attack by the Pakistani army cut off supply lines for an entire district. And it was then, just as the major armies were beginning to face off, and it seemed like the war would take a terrible, deadly, full-scale turn, that both sides miraculously agreed to a ceasefire mediated by the UN. In January 1949, the shooting was over, and the battle's front line became the new border between the dominions, the results of more than a year of combat. Pakistan withdrew all their forces, both their standard army units and their irregular tribal groups, while India only kept just enough soldiers in the area to maintain order, all of which was closely monitored by the UN. As far as territorial changes, Pakistan emerged with newfound control over nearly a third of the province, mostly in the north and west, and India controlled the rest. Pakistan had lost around 6,000 men with 14,000 wounded, and India had lost around 1,000 and 3,000 wounded. But neither of these figures compare to the civilian loss of life, which was likely higher than 50,000, considering the sieges of population centers and the routine killings by extremists on both sides. It's a bit of an abrupt ending to such a complicated topic, and we wish we could end this video by saying that this was the last time war was fought over Kashmir. But unfortunately, that's not the case at all. The ceasefire was adhered to for several years, but like pressure building in a volcano, the the situation was doomed to erupt once again in the future, as both sides continued to claim the entirety of the province, accuse the other of various crimes, and carelessly throw around dangerous rhetoric. Kashmir would become a battleground between India and Pakistan once again in 1965, and this time around, they would throw everything that they had into the fray. But that's a war for another video.